colonial domination in 1957. I was born in the same year as Michael Jackson, whose untimely tragic death shocked the whole world. Michael was also known as the King of Pop and was one of the greatest entertainers that ever lived. The words of his 1991 hit song, "Heal the World," continues to echo to us from his grave. Michael Jackson sang, and I quote, "Heal the world, make the world a better place for you and for me and the entire human race." His song was released in 1991 and came at a time of excitement for the whole world. In the 58 years of my life, I have seen the world change more rapidly than in the millions of years of its existence. My life has spanned the excitement of the post-war era, the heady days of our liberation from colonial rule in Africa, the Apollo moon landing, the Cold War, the excitement at the fall of the Berlin Wall, the era of globalization, the end of apartheid, the global progress of the MDGs, the Arab Spring, Brexit, China's slowdown, SDGs, ISIS, cyber attacks, and it goes on and on and on and on. Mr. President, our world today is more complicated than it has ever been. And the question I ask is, what happened to the ideals that gave birth to this organization, the United Nations? What happened to that enthusiasm that captured the spirit of the post-war world, that envisioned peace, safety, and security for all of mankind? What happened to the excitement at the thawing of the Cold War? And what happened to our joy at the collapse of apartheid? The era of the Cold War created a paradoxical safety and security. The bipolar world and the arms race assured mutual destruction from any nuclear war. And therefore the world was a more predictable place. Those of us in developing countries hid behind our shield of the non-aligned movement. We marched against nuclear armaments and envisioned the day the nuclear arms race would end, so that the trillions of dollars that were being spent by the superpowers on nuclear weapons will yield a dividend that will create a life of prosperity for all people on earth. President Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin in 1987 and said, "Mr. Gorbachev," I quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Quotations closed. In President Reagan's words, walls cannot withstand faith, walls cannot withstand truth, and walls cannot withstand freedom. The fall of the Berlin Wall envisioned a new world, the era of globalization, an age where trade and interaction amongst people of the world would spread prosperity across the globe. A young man in West Africa drops out of school and takes to selling petty items along the streets of the city. Agreeing with 4 of his friends, they decide to raise money and try to make it to the greener pastures of Europe. They pay their way through Niger and arrive at Agadez, from where they brave the trek of death. This is a dangerous hike across the harshest desert on earth, the Sahara. They are attacked by bandits along the way and robbed of all their money and provisions. They are rescued by some good Samaritan. 2 members of their group do not make it through the desert crossing. After months of living under the threat of death from many of the armed groups, including ISIS in Libya, they finally board an overloaded dinghy bound for Italy. Rescued from the sea after their dinghy capsized, only one of them remained, held in a refugee center in Italy. And this could be the story of any young African seeking a better life in Europe. Mr. President, all over the world, there are new walls coming up. Walls that imprison us against the rest of the world. The young African refugee in an Italian detention center is facing one such new wall now. In many parts of the world, extremist forces have hijacked the dialogue, and in the millennial generation, all available cutting-edge technology is being used to spread anxieties that evoke fear and arouse our basest emotions. Hate speech is becoming common. People complain of being tired of being politically correct. In many places, xenophobia has taken over rational thinking. It is a paradox of our world that nearly 30 years after President Reagan called for the Berlin Wall to be torn down, new walls are springing up everywhere. And yet we have the resources in this world to guarantee each person a decent life. In Valletta, the European Union put 1.8 billion euros into an emergency fund to cooperate with Africa in curbing unregulated migration. And yet, with a significant share of the world's arable lands, a youthful labor force, a significant share of the world's natural resources, a reordering of economic relations could create boundless opportunities that will keep young Africans at home and not risk their lives across these perilous journeys. Removing subsidies to farmers of the advanced world will create an even playing field for African farmers to compete. Removing revenue and non-revenue barriers to African produce would give African agriculture a fighting chance. Mr. President, some of the young Africans who hazard the desert and the Mediterranean Sea to cross to Europe from my country are young poultry farmers or other entrepreneurs who sell their shops and undertake the journey because they can no longer compete with the tons of frozen chicken dumped on African markets annually, or the adverse business environment they have to face. Africa does not need your sympathy or overseas development assistance. Africa needs a fair chance to trade with the rest of the world and amongst ourselves. Recently, I took the decision as president to allow citizens of other African countries traveling to Ghana to obtain visas on arrival. This would stimulate trade and investment if it were replicated across the whole of the continent. Structural reforms are required in many areas. Governance is also a critical area that requires reform in Africa. Democracy unleashes the creative juices of our citizens. Africa has made remarkable progress. Elections are held regularly. Civil society groups and think tanks have become more vocal, and the media is increasingly free. And yet there's a lot more that we can do to allow Africans the space to express themselves. Democracy is not a one-size-fits-all system. Different countries are at different stages of the democratic journey. Democracy evolves and cannot be forced on a people. It doesn't help for biggest powers to go proselytizing democracy across the continent. It can have its negative consequences. Mr. President, the mistake with Africa is that we're seen as a homogeneous unit and treated as such, not taking cognizance that we are a whole continent with different aspirations, different cultures, democracies, and even economic development. Africa is a continent of 54 countries at different stages of progress and development. And there must be room for us to make our mistakes and learn from those mistakes. Africa has the potential to be the next continent on the rise. There are many success stories on the continent. Africa has the fastest growing population, meaning a very youthful labor force. It has the fastest growing middle class with increasing disposable incomes. It has the fastest growing information and communication technology networks in the world. Africa needs strengthened institutions, and we're working to build them. We must ingrain transparency and integrity more and more in our governance systems. With the modest progress we're making, we're able to recapture the vision of the founder of our nation. President Kwame Nkrumah was a champion of African liberation and a staunch Pan-Africanist. Mr. President, another threat we must confront together as a united world is the threat of terrorism. No part of the world is safe. In our sub-region, the activities of Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria and the Chad Basin has displaced millions of people and claimed thousands of casualties. Attacks in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Cote d'Ivoire show that all our countries are at risk. Terrorism is currently one of the gravest threats to world peace and security today. We cannot be under any illusions about the imminent threat to all of us, even as we go about our daily activities. Ghana stands in solidarity with all countries that have experienced terrorism recently. 11 long years after the African Union adopted the Eswatini Consensus, we are nowhere near achieving a more equitable reform of the UN Security Council. It is my wish that history will record our time here in this UN General Assembly Hall as one that gave reality to Michael Jackson's song, "Heal the World, Make the World a Better Place for you and for me and for the entire human race."